Every startup tries to be different or unique, but there are some topics that every company has to approach one way or another, and one of those is how to split the equity. Whether it's an energy company or a wearable device, there's equity to be split. So today I'm going to look at the process of splitting equity and take a closer look at some of the good practices as well as the common mistakes when it comes to how to split the equity. Before I get into the methodology and the ins and outs of the actual process of splitting equity, keep this in mind. It takes 5 to 10 years to build a really valuable company. And over that long time frame, there are tons of changes in equity and investors and role changes that initial split in equity no longer really matters. With that said, it's still something that every company has to do, so it's worth being informed about. The easiest way to go about this, and probably the best place to start, is an equal split among co-founders. So every co-founder gets an equal percentage of the 100% of the company. And this is a very good method at avoiding any problems and keeping everyone on the same page, because it's not saying that any one co-founder is more important than another. Y Combinator is the biggest startup accelerator. They recommend this themselves. But in reality, it doesn't always work out that way, and for one reason or another, co-founders will skew equity to one or another. So I'm going to look at those reasons that equity is skewed, both good and bad, and talk a little bit more about them. The first is the idea, and this is by far the most common one. The person that actually came up with the idea that started the company often has a very personal relationship to that idea. You know, it's their baby, they want to grow it, it's their thing, they created it. But it really shouldn't have any correlation to equity, and that's because 9 times out of 10 in a 5 or 10 year period, they'll stray far away from that original idea, making adaptations and responding to the market. And even if that idea is absolutely perfect from the start, it's not the idea that makes it succeed, it's the thousands and thousands of hours of work that follow it over those years, that execution, that determines whether it's successful or not. The next common reason for skewing an equity split is time commitment, and there are kind of 2 parts to this, or 2 ways of interpreting it. The first is when a founder joined, and that really shouldn't correlate to equity. So if we're in a 6 months time frame, the first 6 months of a startup, if somebody joined 2 months in and the rest of them were just right from the start, that doesn't really matter. Consider a 10-year time frame of all those thousands of hours of work. Those 2 months working part-time in the very beginning really doesn't affect how the company plays out and the degree of success it will achieve. However, if you look at time commitment from a consistent basis, like hours per week, if one co-founder for the first 2 years is working 40 hours a week and another is working 3 hours a week, that could be something worth representing in the way the equity is split. The next commonly cited reason is roles, and there is some controversy around this, but I personally think roles should have little to no influence on how equity is split. And that's because, particularly at the start of a startup, the roles are vague and they often overlap with each other, and above all else, even if someone's a programmer, the CEO, or a CTO, they're a co-founder above all else, and they're making strategic decisions about the idea. And I'll use a personal example. I might be the CFO of my startup right now, but if we were given $20 million, the first thing I would do is hire a CFO that's experienced and knows what they're doing, and then just have my role be purely strategic. So those roles being the fact that they're gonna change, especially if the company is successful, you really shouldn't base the equity off of what they're doing right now, because they won't be doing it forever. And the last reason that equity is often skewed that I want to mention is capital contribution. And this is on a scale and it depends on the specific business. But as an example, if I was to spend $200 on components and materials for a prototype, that's not worth any more equity on my part. It's a very nominal amount. However, if I was to spend $30,000 on our first purchase order so that we could delay an investment until our valuation is higher, that is worth equity, because the alternative is getting $30,000 from an investor who would want more equity than I would as an internal contribution of capital. So it's not a concrete line of does it deserve equity or not, but it is at some point worth giving equity. There are a lot of other reasons that founders will skew how the equity is split: connections, resources, location, the list goes on, but those 4 that I mentioned are the most common and often the most mistaken reasons that equity is split in an unequal fashion. The bottom line and the general idea is that think of the big picture. If it wouldn't matter in 10 years, it shouldn't matter right now when it comes to who gets more equity or not. So we've established that splitting equally is a good place to start and generally something you want to be at least close to. Of course, there are exceptions, but no conversation about equity is complete without talking about 2 more things: vesting and investing. In simple terms, vesting makes founders earn their equity over time. And I'll give an example because it's probably the best way to show it. If there was a 4-year vesting period with a 1-year cliff, That 1 year cliff would mean that I don't get any equity for the first year. Only after working for an entire year do I get some of the equity. Maybe I get 20% of my 50% allotted to me after that first year. And then after the second year, I get another 10%. And after the third year, I get another 10%. And after the fourth year, I get that final 10%, totaling to 50%. The idea behind this is basically to prevent any co-founder from working for 6 months and leaving with a third of the company or something. And especially when law firms get involved, vesting can get very complicated. Are they full-time or part-time? Are they on location or are they remote? Do they have other work commitments? Do they have any conflicting commitments? There's a lot of different variables that can go into the equation, but the general premise is you gotta earn your stake to get it. And then comes investing. So every time a company or a startup gets an investment, that's in exchange for equity, say $1 million for 10% or something. And with that could come conditions, say restructuring how the equity is already split among the co-founders. And that 10% that they bought has to come from somewhere. So some startups will address that by leaving 10% or 20% out from the very beginning for future investors, or what I lean towards is just splitting up the 100%, and when investors do come along, just dilute the shares down in proportion. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. For the next video, I was thinking how to pitch your startup to a client or an investor or anybody like that, or an explanation of funding rounds from seed to angel to series A, B, and C. Let me know which one of those interests you the most. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to see more content. And as always, stay classy.